How do you tell the difference between faith and presumption? This is a question I had a user ask me, and they sort of framed it like this. How do I know if I'm acting because God is leading me or because I want to have an experience and then I'm calling that faith, right? How do I tell the difference between acting in faith on something God told me to do versus presuming that it's something that God told me to do, acting on it because I'm trying to sort of fabricate an experience? Or in the same way, how do you tell the difference between when you're acting on the prompting of the Holy Spirit or you're feeling pressure to spiritually perform because maybe you're part of a congregation or a gathering that prioritizes these sort of spiritual experiences? And so if you're not having these experiences, which I've heard that this can happen in some charismatic circles, there are questions about like whether you're saved. I know in some charismatic circles, if you don't speak in tongues, the notion is that you haven't received the Holy Spirit. But the last part of their question, I want to read this here because I think this is super important. They said, how do we honor real spiritual experiences without allowing them to become the measure of God's nearness or the believer's maturity? And I think that right there may be the underlying most important part of this question that we're going to address. Okay, so first we need to make a distinction between a spiritual experience and a spiritual manifestation. Those are two very different things, and it is incredibly important to understand the difference between the two. A spiritual experience just simply means that you experienced something spiritual. Just like if you had a powerful experience, that just simply means you experienced something powerful, right? So when we say we experienced something, what we are describing is our sort of sensory and when I say sensory, it doesn't necessarily have to mean your five senses. It could also be your spiritual sensibilities. But you had a sensory encounter with something. That's what we're describing when we use the word experience. And so to say you had a spiritual experience just simply means that you experienced something or you had a sensory encounter with something supernatural. So a spiritual experience could describe an experience with the demonic. It could describe an experience with God, an experience with Jesus, an experience with the Holy Spirit. There's numerous things that you could kind of categorize in spiritual experience. So this is sort of a generic word to describe an encounter or a sensory encounter with something spiritual. Now, before we get to spiritual manifestation, we also need to make a sort of delineation, if you will, within spiritual experience, which is the reaction to that spiritual experience. So a person might have an emotional response to a spiritual experience, but those two things are not they're not uniquely intertwined. Those two things can happen separately from one another. You could have an emotional reaction to a concert, has nothing to do with the Spirit. Likewise, you could have a spiritual experience without having an emotional response to it. And so having an emotional response to a situation, particularly at church, does not immediately mean that you had a spiritual experience. It can certainly be an indicator that you're having a spiritual experience, but those two things do not necessarily follow one another in all circumstances or in all contexts. This is one of the reasons that we have to be really careful with what we call spiritual manifestations, because a lot of times what can happen is you can have a person who's having an emotional response to a situation, and it appears as though they are having a spiritual manifestation, but that would not meet the criteria of a spiritual manifestation if we actually defined spiritual manifestation correctly. Because spiritual manifestation is not defined as an emotional overflow. That's not what spiritual manifestation is defined as. Spiritual manifestation is defined where Paul says that to each person is given a unique manifestation of the Spirit. And when I say unique, I don't mean unique as in every individual person has their own. I just simply mean unique in the sense that it is distinct from other spiritual manifestations. So a person might have a gift of healing, could be a manifestation of the Spirit. Another person could have the ability to interpret dreams or to grant a word of knowledge, right? But all of these things are for the explicit purpose of the common good and the building up of the body. A person having an emotional reaction to something has nothing to do with the common good. In fact, a person speaking in tongues without an interpreter actually bears no benefit to the common good. And so a person who is exercising a manifestation of the Spirit, particularly if we're talking of tongues, apart from an interpreter, actually is providing no benefit to the body. And so when we speak of spiritual manifestations, we need to speak of them within the confines of the purpose of these spiritual gifts and spiritual manifestations, which is the building up of the body. So if a person is having an experience, right? So let's kind of chain this all together. Let's say a person is having a spiritual experience and they have an emotional response to that spiritual experience. That emotional response is not a spiritual manifestation. That is a person having a spiritual experience and responding emotionally. And that's wonderful. And these are things that should happen. And we should see these types of things, I think, with some regularity. I don't know that we should see it to the degree that sometimes it is promoted, but I do think that there should be some degree of regularity to spiritual experiences and people having a response to those spiritual experiences. We are emotional beings. That's how we express the inner thing that is happening within us, right? Our emotions are the outward expression of the inner experience. And so emotions are appropriate to have two spiritual experiences, right? And spiritual experiences are things that we should be having. However, a spiritual manifestation is specifically and distinctly for the building up of the body. And so if someone is having a spiritual experience and an emotional response, we need to not call that a spiritual manifestation, because that has nothing to do with the building up of the body. That is has to do with their own personal edification, which is exactly what Paul said about speaking in tongues without an interpreter. If you're speaking in tongues publicly without an interpreter, you are edifying yourself, but you are not edifying the body. And that's exactly what Paul said.